Exactly. So.
Thank you, Jacob, and good morning, everyone. My name is Ellen O'Regan. I'm a data protection and privacy reporter at Politico. I hope you've all been enjoying our AI and Tech Week so far, and now I hope you're ready for our next panel, where we will take a deep dive into how Europe can use data as an enabler of innovation. It can feel like there is an overwhelming amount of data out there, with more being generated every second by everything we do, and whoever can connect those dots and make sense of all that data has an incredible resource at their fingertips. The question we want to answer today is how Europe can connect those dots, how we use that data as a powerful enabler of innovation, but also how we do that while upholding fundamental rights like privacy. The European Commission has unveiled its Data Union strategy in November, which aims to make the most of Europe's untapped data potential. We're going to examine whether this will truly give Europe's innovators the access to data they need, who we really mean when we talk about innovators, and who should benefit from the value that data creates. And of course, those questions don't stop at Europe's borders. We live in a world that is intricately connected by webs of data, where the EU has to build strong relationships and trusted pipelines for international data flows, but also protect its sovereignty and be cautious of over-dependencies. These are the questions we're going to tackle today with our top panelists: Patrick Mans, Head of Data and AI Engineering at Philips; Claudio Teixeira, Head of Digital Policy at the European Consumer Organization, or as some of you might know it better, BEUC; Chloe Chéreau, Head of Data Flows, Governance and Privacy at the OECD; and Bjorn Jurecki, Head of Unit for Data Policy and Innovation at DG Connect in the European Commission. I'm going to do a quick fire round and ask you all one question to kick off. And Patrick, I want to come to you first. Speaking for Philips, a major European medtech company, what is the biggest challenge you're dealing at the moment in terms of accessing and using data in Europe?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us here to provide the industry perspective on all of this. Access to data is simply the biggest #1 complaint that we're getting from our R&D leaders. You have to consider we are a global company, so our solutions need to serve patients worldwide. That means that diversity of data for us is key. So you can't just go to a hospital here in Brussels and say, we work with you. The solutions need to work across the globe. So for that, the sharing of data across the European member states is for us a very important thing to have. Once we have data sets, it's also very critical for us to see how can we reuse data sets. So it's all for secondary use of data, research, for the innovative products that we build to create better lives for the people.
And then Claudio, I want to come to you. When you hear that call from industry to maybe unlock data, what's your reaction, and do you think there's a way to do that that could also benefit consumers?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I get to have the red mic, so it kind of makes me feel special today. First of all, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much to Politico for the invitation on behalf of BEUC, the European Consumer Organization. It's always a pleasure to be here to give the consumer perspective. And on this sense, I think the most important thing I would like to start off with is precisely that there is a bit of a mismatch in the narrative, and a bit of a reframing is necessary. And the fact that when we're talking about access to data, the mismatch we find is that we're talking a lot about how to unlock access to data that most likely shouldn't even be out there in the first place, and we're not really concentrating on the data that is already out there, that is already available, but that unfortunately is just too concentrated and too captured by a very small amount of operators, by a very small amount of players that have for years engaged in what we now see as clearly unlawful collection of data through all purposes without any consent from consumers to harness these immense amounts of data sets that now give them this unfair advantage that they're leveraging in all kinds of markets on the digital ecosystem. So when we're talking about access to data, the concentration of the effort should be precisely on ensuring that we can rebalance the act and make sure that the data that is already out there, and it is very much within legal requirements we have today, ensuring the right of privacy of consumers. That's why we have GDPR out there, allowing that this data is indeed not concentrated at the top on the mighty few that are leveraging it to squeeze out the market and kill off competition, to liberate that access and ensuring that all operators have a fair shot at having data, but in a lawful way and in a way that we don't need to squeeze out the most vulnerable part of this chain, which is always the consumer.
And Clarice, I want to come to you next. The OECD does a lot of work and research into how lawmakers can make better data governance policy. Looking at the EU's data rules at the moment, what do you think? Are they up to scratch?
So I want to answer your question directly because my role is actually not to, look specifically at the EU. Obviously, an important stakeholder. The Commission sits at the table, but we have also a great number of European countries, EU countries, but 38 OECD member countries in total. So the real challenge for us is to keep these 38 member countries and also partner economies and civil society groups and business groups around the table to reach consensus. And without consensus, we can't move. The important part, I think, in our work is to make sure that data is considered as a true policy object. It's very easy, to sort of push data back, down the ladder of top priorities. And in many ways, maybe next year, you should position a session on data like in the first morning of the first day, to really show the importance of data. This is not about compliance anymore. We see that a lot of countries are looking at these issues through the lens of national security, data as an economic asset, and that's really moved the needle a bit. I think it's very complex also because of this evolution of data as an economic asset and an economic security object in a way, to absorb all the dimensions for policymakers generally, not only parliaments, right? Really the whole institutional ecosystem to actually handle the challenges in competition, consumer protection, privacy, innovation, policies, et cetera, et cetera. That is really a challenge, and we're trying at the OECD to support countries in doing that, and I'm happy to talk about a few of our recent successes in that regard.
Perfect. I will come to you first, Bjorn, and ask you about the data union strategy, the Commission's plan to unlock European data. What would you say are the real game changers in that strategy?
I mean, the real game changer for me is really increasing the access to data. I mean, we've already heard it now from the representative of Philips, how important the data is. I mean, compute is a bit generic. I mean, you'll not find an algorithm that says, okay, I was trained on cloud XYZ. That's not a differentiator. Also, the algorithms themselves are a bit converging in terms of performance and output. I mean, there are still differences between them, but in the medium to long term, I think they will get closer to each other. So the key differentiator will be really the data that is, used to train the algorithm. And I think this is where we can try to make a difference in the data union strategy to increase really the availability of unique data sets. And just to give you maybe 2 or 3 examples, scientific data I think is a very interesting area. I mean, we have someone here from Philips Healthcare, so this is I think an area we can make a huge difference. I mean, we're all aware of Google DeepMind's breakthrough with AlphaFold based on a European public database of proteins. So the question is, can we replicate this in other scientific domains, gather the data and make it available to European innovators? Then also sectorial data sharing ecosystems. I mean, we have now around 180 data space initiatives in Europe, some very successful. For example, the cancer image data space that we are funding with millions of cancer images being available. And overall, you see a lot of uptake now and also investments by private actors to get into this data space area. And the last example is public sector data. We have quite a comprehensive framework in place already with the Open Data Directive, and we want to update that now in the data union strategy to add additional public sector data sets to it. So, I mean, from our perspective, I think this is the key pillar of the data union strategy. How can we address this issue of data scarcity and make more data available to European innovators? Mm-hmm.
So we've got about 180 data spaces. Are there more coming? And I think also the strategy mentions data labs. Where are we with those? And, where are we going in terms of data spaces and data labs?
I mean, for data spaces, it's important to be aware that these are not necessarily publicly funded data spaces, and this is good. I mean, if you want to have a thriving data economy, you need private sector investments. So we provided seed funding in a number of areas. I mentioned the cancer image data space, which is funded by us, but now we also see lots of initiatives that are not funded by us, and they're very successful. We had the Data Space Symposium in February in Madrid, and there was also Data Spaces Awards, and the 2 winners in the 2 categories were not funded by us at all. So one very interesting initiative in Belgium on agricultural data sharing, and one related to healthcare data sharing in Germany. So I think this really shows that this private sector investment is happening, and this is really crucial, I think. And this is also a bit the future of the data spaces, I would say. I mean, we will continue funding data spaces, but maybe focusing more on areas of public interest, environment, healthcare, and leave more commercial areas to the private sector. The idea for the data labs is to provide an easy entry point, especially for SMEs. It can be a bit overwhelming, all these 180 data spaces, the public sector data that we have. So the idea is that you as an SME can go to these data labs, and they help you with all kinds of data governance related questions, getting an overview of what data is available in data spaces, helping you also with compliance questions related to GDPR, copyright, trade secrets, helping you with the production of synthetic data. Initially, we will set them up in the AI factory, so that's the first entry point, but the concept is open to anyone who wants to use it. It's not a brand we exclusively own. So the first data labs will become operational in the course of this year, and then we also hope, like with data spaces, that the private sector gets into that area and provides similar services.
If you allow me to respond as the industry here, we really welcome that. So EU came, the cancer images that you mentioned, we at Philips are contributing and working with that, and like that we also have monitoring initiatives. So this is really a good step up where you bring data together across the Union, stimulated indeed by the European Union. So we welcome that a lot. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on data spaces?
Sure. So data spaces is really an area where we're zooming in, as Björn knows. I think it's very important, first of all, to highlight that data spaces are not an EU exclusive, right? Other countries, like Japan, for instance, have developed their own set of data spaces, clearly with the objective of making them interoperable with foreign data spaces, so potentially in the EU, but also elsewhere. So that's really important. What Björn mentioned was really interesting, that you really need to look at the economic context and the business context of data spaces. We do a lot of economic analysis. That's our forte at the OECD. This is what we do. And what you can see is that very often data spaces are actually, great in startup phase. They're publicly funded, it works, and then the financial runway can be very limited, and then there will be a quick end to the story, and your business model cannot be limited if you're in the private sector to applying for grants, getting public money as much as you can, and then the business model is kind of left behind. And I think that's really the challenge today, and it's great to see that we're really going into this conversation on defining the economic boundary conditions of data spaces to make sure that this space is sustainable.
If I can just come in there, because that's a very important point, and that's why I use any opportunity I can to really push for this private sector commitment to data spaces and co-investment, if you want. And also, it is very important that data spaces develop viable business models so that they also generate some income. I mean, the business model cannot be, let's get another round of public funding. I mean, our funds are also limited, they have to work on their own in a way, and only then you also have a thriving data economy. It cannot be that, the thriving data economy is dependent just on public sector funding. I mean, there are so many demands on public sector funding as well, and even more in the future, I think, that we can probably not maintain that level of investments there. So, developing a viable business model, generating private income, if you want, is super important for our data spaces to be sustainable.
Claudio, do you have any thoughts on data spaces, if they can kind of help redistribute some of that data, as you mentioned earlier?
I mean, definitely. Any initiative that has the word interoperability in it sounds great from a consumer perspective. We haven't had enough of it. But the problem with WAS is that that's only one part of the issue. And that when we see the data strategy in general, that's the problem we have, which is the actual principle that seems to be guiding this aspect, is that we are making the decision not to challenge the source of the problem, which is the concentration of data, and we're actually trying to tackle downstream by saying that we should make more data, other categories of data weren't until now make it available for obvious reasons, available now. And that's the problem that we see that is challenging from our perspective. And this is not an isolated case, because you just need to look around to see how the legislative push in this new term of the Commission has been precisely with the focus on that to ensure somehow that data is made cheaper in the EU, like the Draghi report says. First of all, that's already quite an interesting conception. It's just how cheap should we make it? But the question is for us, indeed, at what cost? And for us, it is clear that the regulation or deregulation move that is going across the board, either on GDPR, AI, I guess we'll get to the omnibus eventually, seems to us that the priority seems to be that in order for the industry to get more data, the sacrificial lamb here should be the consumer. And the data until now was off bounds and protected for very good reason. And this is something that, when it comes to specifically on AI, we are seeing very concerning signs that this is the push. We sure have some good initiatives here that could have been pushed further, but ultimately the root of the problem is not being sufficiently addressed. And we feel that even though you will make sure that you have more data available, you will still end up not correcting the fundamental imbalance that you have today, meaning that you are not giving more data to those who actually need it. You're still going to give it in a way that it will make sure that those who have an entrenched position in the market will retain that. And those are not European companies, and those are not European startups. And until we actually have measures that address this imbalance, it's not by giving the crumbs at the table from the usual suspects that is going to solve it. We need to go after the big cats and have changes that have the courage to do just that.
I think that's a good segue to bring us on to the digital omnibus. The AI omnibus, as we know, reached a deal in the early hours of this morning, but it looks like it's really a long road ahead before we get to the same point with the digital omnibus. Bjorn, I want to come to you first. Earlier this week, we heard that the digital omnibus might reach the limits of our legal system in the European Union, that it involves so many laws and it could create such complex negotiations. What's your initial reaction to that?
I mean, yes, we touch upon a lot of laws, but I mean, I don't find it like impossibly complex, to be honest. And actually, we want to reduce the complexity as well. If I just look at the laws that are in the remit of my team, the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, the Open Data Directive, and the Free Flow of Data Regulation, we actually want to repeal all of them and just concentrate in one law. So I'm merging a lot of laws into one, which also makes it easier for, I think, businesses and citizens to understand the interactions between the different parts. So, I mean, we actively want to reduce the complexity. Maybe allow me also one comment to what Claudio, was your name, I think, said earlier. I mean, I would take issue with your claim that we are like deregulating and so on. I mean, we do not want to lower the level of protections. What we do, we want to reduce the friction for businesses to implement these rules, but there is no lowering of protection, I would say. When I look at the Data Act, for example, I mean, this is maybe not personal data, but more non-personal data. I mean, we want to make it a bit easier for businesses to deal with data leakage to third countries. Maybe that's also an issue that Clarisse from OECD can talk about. This is a concern we had from stakeholders. So we are refining a bit the trade secret handbrake to that end, that companies can also withhold data if there's a high risk of that data leaking to third countries with lower levels of protection. But we're not questioning the objective of the Data Act as such, and all the enforcement mechanisms also stay in place. So in that sense, we're not lowering the level of protection or lowering the ambition of the Data Act. We're just making it a bit easier for businesses to operate these laws, I would say.
Grace, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. So I can't comment on the omnibus itself, right? As usual, I represent more countries than the EU countries, strictly speaking. A very important point, I think it's a slight segue from what Claudia said. I'll try to stay in the middle. When I hear cheap data as a former privacy regulator, that makes me cringe a bit, I must say. And I totally get why a civil society group would cringe as well. Unfortunately, there are lots of oversimplification in this conversation. Also, we use a lot of interoperability without being very clear about what this means. What is absolutely true, though, is that the issue of compliance costs being too high undermines the whole conversation, and we need to make this conversation simpler and streamline obligations and rights so that all those provisions, to be implemented at the global level, like you were saying, right, for a company like Philips, actually, so that it's made easier and we truly achieve the public interest purpose behind all those legislations. And today we're doing research together with the Global Privacy Assembly and the International Association of Privacy Professionals. We're running global surveys to understand what the challenges are of complying with this global web of regulations beyond the EU, right? It's a global challenge. And the feedback is unanimous. It's hard for the regulators, so that impedes their capacity to cooperate, including in cross-border enforcement actions. It's hard for businesses, big and small. So we need to help with that. And the implementation review of GDPR actually said that even within the provisions that are left to the member states to implement, there is fragmentation as well. So it's not something that can be left aside. Too high compliance costs, and I know I have to close, too high compliance costs actually means discrediting the legislation and criticizing GDPR, for instance, in particular, instead of trying to understand what exactly these laws, these regulations seek to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Maybe, Patrick, if I can bring you in again, what are your thoughts on the digital omnibus proposal as the Commission has tabled it, but also how the conversation is moving now in Council and maybe how negotiations might shape up?
Yeah. So, one of the things we struggle with in the industry is, of course, how the different legislations and policies were not necessarily aligned with each other. So, from that perspective, we absolutely welcome the omnibus on seeking for the alignment. We're now, of course, very curious to see how are you going to move forward. How are you going to move forward, implementing this across the member states, and does that lead to fragmentation, yes or no? The last thing we want is fragmentation. You mentioned interoperability, a very important part for us to see how that comes in. Also, I want to say, of course, being in healthcare, for me, data has a bit of a different meaning than being in a different industry. It really matters on what do you use the data for and getting things done. So very happy to see where it's going to end. I heard that this morning at 4:30 agreement was reached. Do not know about the details of these things, but we'll definitely look with strong interest at that from Philips.
Mm-hmm. And Claudio, I'll bring you in again. What are your thoughts on where the digital omnibus proposal is heading and where it's going in Council at the moment?
Yeah, indeed. The deal at 4:30 is the reason why I'm having this mic and not the other one, because it took me a bit while to get a reaction out, but it's already out there. We've taken the time to go through it, and here is I have to disagree with Bjorn. We are lowering the level of protection. And I have to say one thing, is that if we're not lowering it even further, if you look at the AI omnibus, it's precisely because legislators at a good point have said this is going too far. And you ask EDPS, you ask EDPB, great trade opinion. You ask the protection authorities in member states, you ask civil society, you ask the broad majority of stakeholders, which are not industry, and even parts of the industry, and they will tell you, this is not simplification, this is deregulation. And I heard yesterday you had a very good panel where you even have some very good prominent MEPs who will hold the drafting pen on the digital omnibus, telling you very clearly that no, it's not simplification, this is deregulation, this is what we want, and we're going to take it further. So let's get the act together first and foremost to understand that this is what we're dealing with. And what we really see in these proposals is what we're getting. Fortunately, common sense still prevails a bit in ensuring the worst is not there. But if you look at the AI omnibus, if this is the sign of what is to come on GDPR, we should be quite fearful of the outcome. Because it isn't just about legislative coherence and bad drafting, because there's a lot. Because of course, in such a rushed procedure with no time for impact assessment, proper public consultations, completely disregarding better regulation principles, of course, what could you get? Within a process that normally takes 3 months, legislators are given 1 week for amendments, one do what one can. But looking at what we're seeing, we already have significant carve-outs for specific legislation of products that should have its AI embedded systems submitted to a very clear level of control and compliance costs. We're not going to get that. We already see allowing of processing of sensitive data for AI training. Doesn't seem that's a compliance cost there. And we already see a complete fragmentation, not streamlining, but actual fragmentation by allowing that somehow the Commission is going to be able to have delegated acts to figure out how some things match in the end, so with specific mechanisms. This is more complexity. This is more fragmentation. This is more confusion and uncertainty. And at a time where we're talking about scaling up and improving the economy and the certainty of the market, and also the certainty for consumers on what these rules are, it is definitely not by reopening a law in which the ink was barely dry on paper, and through all the compliance efforts that companies were already in the process of doing, and adding that, yes, a lot more compliance costs by having to say now, okay, we know we had one law just 12 months ago, but now you have to change everything. Forget what you were told. This is the new legislation. This does not give certainty. This does not give confidence to the market. This does not give the ability to companies to have a very clear understanding of how these laws work in order to comply. And this ultimately doesn't give consumers any certainty of how to protect their rights, because that means their rights are going to stay on paper if they cannot really operationalize and know how to actually defend them, because things keep changing.
I might give Bjorn a chance to respond to that.
Because I can give you a good example where we reduce fragmentation, where we lower implementation costs for businesses, and I think also increasing the rights of citizens, and that's cookies. As you know, we're proposing as part of the Digital Omnibus to move the cookie rules from the current e-privacy directive meaning 27 transpositions in member states, to the GDPR, one regulation for the whole of the EU. So that reduces fragmentation. I think everybody would hopefully agree with that, and also brings it under the GDPR enforcement framework, also make it easier to ensure the enforcement. We are also offering then certain exemptions to process data without consent related to network security, for example, and audience measurement. Then the final element is that we're also empowering citizens, for example, through websites respecting the cookie choice for 6 months, having also one button on the cookie banner to refuse all cookies, and crucially to enable also the setting of cookie preferences in the browser. So you can just say once I reject cookies or accept cookies, and then websites have to respect that with an exemption for media service providers. And through these measures, we think the number of cookies will be lowered dramatically, resulting in overall savings for business of 1.5 billion euros. I think this is a good example where we lower implementation costs, we make it much easier for citizens to exercise their rights, and we reduce fragmentation as well, because it's not 27 different regimes any longer, but just the GDPR and the enforcement structures.
Yeah, please.
I just have to say, I have to reply to this one, because indeed this is a great idea. And this is something that is a good example that for us of that simplification should actually look like. Simplification like this is the kind of example that makes consumers easier to understand their rights, defend their rights, and ensures that people have a clear understanding of how to give informed consent. This would have been great. Problem is, right now, all the process is going, and how the changes are happening in the omnibus. If you actually look at what the proposals are doing, because we're putting e-privacy into GDPR, and then most importantly, we have the change to the definition of personal data. The problem is, in isolation, this sounds like a good idea, but if you read the overall, you have the holistic approach at what the digital omnibus is doing, you actually might end up with a law on cookies that doesn't apply to cookies. And that's just one example, where I can tell you that it sounds great on paper, but due to the rush of this process, if you actually what's in there, it's not coherent. And if it gone to its full extent, we might actually have this almost paradoxical situation. And we actually, something that should protect consumers and should be a great idea, due to like bad implementation or conflicting interests of some other stakeholders, might not work in practice. And that's why from the beginning we said this process needs to be slowed down. This also needs to be based on real evidence, on actual impact assessment, on proper public consultation, so that even great ideas, as the one that Bjorn just said, can be implemented properly in order that they do defend consumers' rights and not benefit other stakeholders out there.
Clarice, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, because my neighbors were playing ping pong over me, and clearly they will not agree. So I thought maybe I could just introduce a bit of an idea here, that definitely measurement is something which Bjorn mentioned. I think measurement is something that we're still very much lacking in this space. We're actually we lack data about data. So it's really important to work together on understanding what is the value of sharing data, not putting a price on data, but really understanding the value, the merits, really the value of sharing the data, of collecting it in the first place, et cetera, et cetera. So we're working very hard on that. We need data about data. The second thing is, forgive me, this is a bit of a typical conversation when we run down the regulation rabbit hole. These are extremely important conversations, no doubt, but it's really important to take a step back and look at how these regulatory discussions actually take place within a broader landscape that include multi-stakeholder consultation and collaboration, and that is absolutely key, including civil society and obviously business and the technical community that we tend to overlook. It's really important to bring people together. We're just discussing before when we were prepping, and we're fighting for our mics. We're just discussing how at the OECD we've set up a working group to facilitate cross-border health data sharing by, first of all, understanding how that sharing works, where the data is located, how professionals, in fact, protect the data, what are their priorities, the regulatory challenges they meet, but also the technical challenges they meet. And it can be from, having a common definition around the globe of the concept of public interest to reuse the data, to do secondary use of the data. This is a very concrete project that we're running, where I think we can make an impact by clarifying legal concepts, but also understanding where privacy-enhancing technologies can be used or not used, the limitations of these technologies, and how countries can actually work towards really interoperable solutions in that case. Again, I think being as practical as we can is really the way forward. In our case, the challenge, again, is to keep 38 countries around the table, some of which have, clearly differing agendas and, reasons for disagreements are many, but coordination, cooperation, multi-stakeholder cooperation as a key to promoting a data transfer, pro-data transfer agenda, pro-growth agenda, but protective of the interests of individuals, whether data subject or consumers, is absolutely key.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also where we feel some friction here and there. Huh? So we're living in unprecedented times. There's a tectonic change happening right now with AI and what's being expected. Look at those hyperscalers. Every week they release new products, new things come out. So if you as an industry in between there on like, hey, new things coming out, your customers expecting new things, and I hear you saying the concern like, hey, we're rushing things here. So this is also the call here, like how can we as regulators, also see like how do we match that age of intelligence that we now live in with coming with the appropriate speed on what comes while still protecting our consumers, because let's not go speed over protection on this. Let's make that very clear. But sometimes it's like, okay, we're going to do this in 2030. Wow, in my world of AI, you cannot even imagine what's happening in 2030. So clearly also to ask to see like how can we as regulators accelerate that journey as well here.
Mm. Bjorn, did you have a response to
Just
something?
wanted to comment on the absence of an impact assessment. I mean, yes, there was no impact assessment for the digital omnibus, but it doesn't mean we have no evidence for what we are doing. I mean, we've run so many workshops before the run-up to presenting our proposal. Sectorial workshop with all kinds of industries, civil society, publishers. There was an implementation dialogue where all the groups were involved. There was an SME panel to, in particular, solicit the views of SMEs, public consultation with hundreds of submissions, and all this then put together in a staff working document with the evidence that we have gathered. So yes, there was no formal impact assessment, but at the same time, we have some evidence to, justify what we are doing. Mm-hmm. And maybe just briefly on this issue of, the speed of the developments, and maybe this is also linking to the international scene, because sometimes I have the impression what we wrote in the data union strategy on the international pillar is already kind of outdated by the developments you see there as well. I mean, China put forward a World Data Organization. There are new laws popping up everywhere. So the speed of these developments is really a challenge, I think, for policymakers in all kinds of domains. And I don't think we have a very convincing answer yet how we, address this issue of speed and given the procedures we have.
I think, of course, the sense of urgency is there, but on this argument of an impact assessment, is it too late to do one? Is there a possibility that the Commission could still do one for the digital omnibus? Is it something you would consider?
They are very time consuming, and then you completely mess up the timetable that we have set ourselves, and the political goal is to complete it as soon as possible. So I'm not sure it's realistic to do an impact assessment while we are already, negotiating the proposal.
Mm-hmm.
Can I, Ellen? Sorry, go ahead. Okay. No, about this time is of the essence conversation, I think it's really true. And I'm really, as a European, sometimes it hurts to hear that, regulation is always put forward as an impediment, to development, to growth, and, at the end of the day, effective protection of individuals. I lived in Asia many, many years. You have no idea the pace of development, like even in Southeast Asia. I was based in Singapore. Things were changing, like literally every day. And the government was truly, creating this ecosystem for responsible innovation. You may, from the outside, challenge that, but really when you're inside, you see it. And, really it goes so fast. And what is really specific about the EU, and everybody tends to forget, is that it is a union. It's like a lot of economies and countries put together, so just that in itself is powerful. But at the same time, I mean, I'm not justifying the fact that no impact assessment has been made, but this sense of urgency, we feel it every day, and it's true that we have to move faster, for sure.
Claudio, you want to come in?
Yeah, I don't want to get stuck on timelines, but first of all, well, I hope you have evidence before you do something like this. I mean, it would be very concerning if you didn't. That's number one. But number two, on the public consultations, I just have to say this, like, as a on defense of our own role. I mean, we did participate in the implementing dialogue. We submitted a contribution to the call for evidence, as everyone. But I think everyone can agree that the broad changes that were present in this digital omnibus, wherein 90% of this was never on the table of the implementation dialogue. It was not in the concept note of the call for evidence. So 90%, and that includes the most damaging proposals on the table, personal data, cookies, we can go down the list. The fact remains, those were not in the consultation. I know there was a speed for urgency, but I'm quite sure that in the month between the implementation dialogue, the call for evidence, and the proposal, there could have been time to let us know, hey, this is coming. What do you think about it? And I'm sorry to say, but I believe that would have actually saved us time if the Commission had the forthcomingness to just say, look, we're planning on doing this. What do stakeholders think? Like you've always done. And the process always worked smoothly, and that would have actually saved a lot of the friction we're seeing now. I think Council's already dropped completely the definition of personal data to show you how that is clear. We would have saved a lot of time in discussing. And I was reading your newsletter this morning, and I was just noting this particular comment from the Polish side on saying, regarding Germany's push to change the AI rules, next time you have any concerns on a piece of regulation, please tell us sooner. And that's pretty much it. If we have consultations, proper consultations in place before, when the time is right, maybe down the road you will save actually some time in changing what probably shouldn't have need to be changed in the first place. And the fact that we are changing the AI Act 1 year and a half since it's been adopted, and when most of those enhancements still even come into force, that shows clearly how proper consultation, take your time preparing something as broad, a broad scope as this, will save you time in the long run. So even on urgency side, it's always better to take things at a normal pace.
We're nearly out of time. Do you have any final thoughts from any of the other panelists before we wrap up?
Simply from the industry here, there are many discussions always like, hey, will the European Union be a superpower in innovation compared to the US and China, or are we losing? My view on that is, in Europe, we have fantastic talent. We have great companies, both startups as large-scale companies, to do these kind of things. We have a set of very strong values in the European Union here to do this. As you said, time is of essence in moving forward. We can take that lead in innovation as a European Union, but we also have to make sure that the time is with us to get these kind of things done.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Patrick, Claudio, Clarice and Bjorn, for your insightful thoughts and knowledge and food for thought, I think, about the digital omnibus. And speaking of food, up next, I know what you're all really waiting for. It's time for our networking lunch. We will be back at 1:50 for an interview with Commissioner Zareva, so see you soon.
Are united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
We are doing this in our open democracies, discussing this all open and loud, and I'm not for that.
What is European Union? What is freedom? How we learn together.
The obvious question is, what is the EU doing? What is our plan?